I just want to start this section with a couple of stories. One of them is one of my old favourite stories, goes back to 1993, and I've told this a lot, and if anyone here's heard my tapes, you've probably heard it before, but I'm going to tell you for the sake of those who haven't heard it. But in 1993, I had a visit from an old man. He was 95, and his name was Len. And Len came to Living Valley Springs just as an outpatient with his wife. And when he came into my office, he was bent over like this. And he looked up at me and he said, I was wondering if you could fix up my wife. And so we sat down and he said, I'm actually 95. He said, my first wife died quite a long time ago, and I went to a lot of trouble to get myself a young one the second time. He said, in fact, she was only 63 when we got married. He said, and she's only 72 now, so we've been married 9 years, but he said, she's starting to get health problems like my first wife did. But he said, I'm 95, and I'm thinking if she dies, it's going to be really hard for me to get another one. And he said, so if you can try and do something with her so that she'll last me till I die. So the result was that they both came to Living Valley Springs and they both did the 10-day program. Well, we didn't put Len through a cleanse really because he was pretty clean. And we noticed this man had some tremendous habits in his life that he developed at a very young age. And we just fed him his 3 meals a day, and he was there mainly to accompany his wife. But we noticed that he made a habit of drinking a lot of water. Every morning, when he got out of bed, he wanted like a lot of water, about a litre of water, and he liked to put lemon in it. And every day, he would, bending over like this, he would run right up our hill, and he'd do a lot of exercise. And as far as his back was concerned, we actually had a low number of guests that particular program. So we had plenty of staff on hand, and so we were able to spend over 3 hours a day working on Len's back. And one of our therapists, John Corin, spent 3 hours every day working on Len's back, on the ligaments and on the muscles. And at the end of 10 days, we had him perfectly up straight. And he left there as a perfectly up straight man. He was just, his ligaments had just got so tight and his muscles had got tight, and gradually it had pulled him over. You find also with that tendency, you find there's a problem in the back of the legs. And the muscles in the back of his legs had become very tight, and they were pulling his pelvis and forcing him over. So we worked on his legs and we worked on his back, and he was fine. But I was quite impressed. I used to sit there just watching this guy who was just full of life at the age of 95. And I said to him, Len, I've got to know, what's your secret? What is it? Well, I know one thing is you drink a lot of water, you do a lot of exercise, you only eat 3 meals a day, and you don't eat big meals. Now, that's another thing that I've found with people who live long. And I get my notebook out and I find they never have big meals. They make sure they have little meals, but they make sure that all the nutrients they need are in those small meals. They don't eat any junk because they haven't got enough room to fit the junk in their small meal. So they only have the good stuff. And he was like that. He never ate between meals. He never had anything between meals except water. I noticed he had a good attitude to life, very happy attitude. He was funny. He had a tremendous sense of humour. And I said to him, when did you get like this? And he said, well, when I was 16. He said, when I was 16, he said, I got hold of a book. And it was the book I showed here on the first night called Health and Happiness. And he said that this book changed his life because it really laid out the principles of healthful living, the 8 laws of health that Graham had up on the board earlier tonight. What did you call it there, Graham? It was called the health model. And he said that he'd been following these 8 laws of health meticulously for around 81 years, or 80 years, like ever since he was 16. And as a result, he'd experienced good life, and he'd really enjoyed his life. He said that he'd always made sure that he got out in the garden regularly every day, and he grew a lot of his own food. He did plenty of exercise, he drank plenty of water, he got enough sunlight, he had a good attitude to things, and he made sure that he ate right, and he never smoked, he never drank alcohol, and he never drank coffee or tea, and he kept away from those stimulating foods that cause hormonal changes in the body, like coffee. He never drank soft drinks or Coke or any of those sugar things, and so he looked great. He had good skin. At the age of 95, he had very good skin, and he still had good hair too. Not a lot of it, but what was there was real good. Anyway, 2 years later, Len died, and his wife called me up and she said that he'd passed away, and I said, what happened? And she said, well, he was out in the garden and he was picking some vegetables for lunch, and he came in and then he just fell over, and he said, Doris, I can't get up. So she said, well, I better get the ambulance. So she said, we got the ambulance, they came and we went to hospital, and then they got me, and this is what Doris told me. She said they took me into a room where he was, and he was lying there with a big smile on his face, and I thought he was okay, and I went over and he was dead. And she said he died with this big smile on his face. Yeah, and I said, well, that's the way to go. You see, the thing is that we're not meant to die from disease. You know, Moses, it tells us in the Bible, was 120 years of age, and it says there that at that age his natural forces were unabated, which means that he had all his natural forces. It says that his eyes were not dimmed. He had perfect eyesight. He was 120, and God told him to climb up to the top of Mount Nebo and lie down and go to sleep and die, because his time was up. Right, now that's the way we should be going. And if we've got that set in our mind that that's how we're going to do it, well, then we've got a great chance of doing it that way. But if we think, well, it's normal as you get older to get a bit of arthritis and a few other problems, well, then we'll probably get them. But you've got to reject all that. And if we follow the 8 laws of health like Lenny did, well, then we will reap the benefits like he reaped. You know, the only thing that I would have recommended to him would have been to have regular massages so that his muscles and ligaments didn't get so tight. Now, another story I wanted to tell you was about last night I talked about dental amalgam, and I forgot to tell you one story. It was a man that came from New Zealand about 2 years ago. He's quite a prominent man in New Zealand, and he's 60 years of age. He had leukemia and lymphoma. And he came over to see me because he couldn't understand how he could get this disease, because he was a very health-loving man. He grew a lot of his own food. He had a lot of his own fruit trees. He did everything organically. He exercised regularly every day, and he got his morning sun. He drank 2 to 3 litres of water every day. He'd never drunken coffee or tea or soft drinks. He'd never drunk alcohol. He'd never smoked tobacco. His father was almost 90 and still working as a gardener at an old people's area. And he said, I can't understand how I could get these diseases. And I just said, could you open your mouth and give me a look in there? I want to see your teeth. And he said, I got good teeth, I see the dentist every year. So I went in there with my torch. And I said this in America once. I said, I put my torch in the lady's mouth, and they all freaked out because over in America a torch is a big flame. And they said, didn't you burn her? Anyway, they call them a flashlight. So I put the flashlight there in his mouth, and I could see the huge amount of amalgam. There was 10 amalgams, and he had 5 dead teeth, root canal teeth, that he thought were quite sound. They functioned well, and the dentist checked them every year and said they were okay. So I sent him off to an X-ray, and these 5 dead teeth looked like there was a bit of a big problem in the bone marrow where the roots were. So I sent him to a dentist in New Zealand, a biological dentist in Tauranga. And this guy was about to close his practice and go to America and become a professor. So he was booked out, but he managed to fit this guy in over the weekends. And when he took out those 5 teeth, he took out the amalgams first. And you really should always take out amalgam before you take out the root canal teeth. Otherwise you can have mercury in the mouth when you've got a wound, and that's not good. But he took out the amalgam, then he took out the 5 teeth over a period of weeks. And under every tooth in the bone marrow there was a big ball of infected matter. Now that matter was sent off to a laboratory, and it came back with a report saying that all of these balls of matter contained huge amounts of leukemia and lymphoma cells. So the leukemia and lymphoma was emanating from those roots of those teeth. Low-grade infection. Over many years, those teeth had been root canaled many years ago. And slowly a low-grade infection developed into a major infection. The body couldn't deal with it, and it developed into a cancerous condition. Now, 3 weeks after the last tooth was done, and I must say, during those 3 weeks, that man went through a lot of trouble. I mean, he had 5 teeth taken out. He had to learn how to use dentures, and he was miserable for a few weeks. But at the end of 3 weeks, he went along to pathology, and he had another CAT scan done, another blood test, and so on. And there was not a leukemia cell in his body. The man's leukemia was completely gone in 3 weeks after the last tooth was removed. Now, he then came to Australia then in the January the following year, and with his wife, and they did a full 10-day recovery program, and we set him right on the right path. Now, the interesting thing was that a dentist who knew him, who'd done some of his dental work over the years, had heard that he was getting all this dental work undone, and he was quite upset about it. And he'd spoken to some of their associates and said he was quite annoyed about this man going and getting these amalgams taken out and these teeth taken out that were quite good. So he said, we'll see what happens. Well, in a few months, as this man's lymphoma, which was a big cancer in the abdomen, was shrinking away and his leukemia had gone, the dentist in New Zealand came across to Australia because he couldn't get to the dentist in New Zealand because he'd gone to, like the guy who'd done the work had gone to America. But this other fellow came across to Australia to meet Eric Davis. And he met him, he spent a whole day with him, he had dinner with him, and by about midnight that night, going through a whole lot of case studies, he said, I can't ever put an amalgam filling in anyone's mouth again. I can't ever do a root canal again. And Eric said, well, why don't you go back and just do the ones that you've got booked in, and then start changing your practice? And he said, I can't. He said, I can't put another one in someone's mouth knowing now what I know. And Eric said, well, that's the answer I was hoping you'd give. He said, I'm looking for a moral dentist to come and work for me. He said, why don't you close up your practice over there and come over here? So that man now works for Eric Davis in Margate. His name's Jesse O'Neill. And he's now on the team, and he's being trained in biological dentistry. So isn't that a good story? You know, with a good conclusion. Now, the patient is now tremendously healthy. I have regular contact with him, and he was so happy that he helped us with a few projects at Living Valley Springs. We've tarred all our roads, and he helped us with that. And he's getting involved with helping us now with developing our program out there. Now we'll get back onto the health of the mind. They were 2 stories I needed to tell you. But I wanted to talk a little bit about relationships, because relationships play a big part in our happiness, don't they? There's relationships between husbands and wives, and relationships between fathers and daughters, and fathers and sons, and mothers and daughters, and so on. And there's relationships between friends. And if we've got problems in these relationship areas, it usually affects our chemistry, and we can get ill health as a result. So we need to look at relationships as being very important. And you know, we've had a lot of cases of people that have come to Living Valley Springs in a very unhappy marriage situation. I remember one couple that came, and when they arrived separately, and they told me that they'd separated a week ago, or it was a few weeks ago actually, and they said, but we decided we'd come to Living Valley Springs and we'd meet there and we'd clean up our health and see if we could do something about our marriage. So I ended up playing the role of marriage counsellor with them. And I got talking to them quite a fair bit, and the problem was that the man was a very strong, dominating man, and he didn't really recognise the needs of his wife. And I told him, I said, you know, you're the leader of your family, and it's your very first responsibility in life. The very first and most important responsibility is to make your wife happy. Now, if she's not happy, no matter what she's doing, he would say, yeah, but she does this and she does that. And I said, but you've got to be above that in order that you can produce an environment for her where she doesn't carry on like that. You know what I'm saying? So he got the picture, and I said to him, you know, you need to go out and get her some flowers and start being nice. So anyway, he went all over our property looking for flowers, and he found some wild flowers and he brought them back, and that was the beginning. And I've kept in touch with them, and they've got a tremendously happy marriage because it took one person to work it out and make a decision, and then there was a domino effect. You know, everything flowed on, and the whole family's been happy ever since. And he's always appreciated that 10 days he spent with us. Now, we had another man that came up and said that he was he was going to divorce his wife when he got home. He said that the reason being was that when he got married, he had a very happy relationship, but he was an accountant and he wanted to be a lawyer, so he went back to college for quite a few years. And during that time, she was the breadwinner, and she supported him and she doled out the money and all that. And during that time, he said, I think she just lost respect for me. But he said, now I'm practicing law, I'm a barrister, but he said that she has not gone back into the submissive position that I'd like her to go into. He said she's still trying to dominate me. He said to the point that, like he said, if I leave a sock on the floor in the bedroom, she throws a tantrum, she'll throw saucepans at me. You know, like, yeah, he said it's intolerable. He said, no, he said, I come up here to do a cleanse to get my head clear, and then I'll go home and start divorce proceedings. See, so I said to him, well, would you like her to be exactly like what she was when you first got married? And he said, oh, yeah, but long gone, impossible. And I said, well, what about if you become like what you were back then? You know, like I said, how was your courtship? What were the things that you did? And we talked about it. He just laughed and laughed. But anyway, apparently he went home and he did it. I said to him, if she starts throwing a tantrum, take responsibility. You know, sometimes we've got to accept responsibility when it's not our fault. And that's not a bad thing to do. You know, like sometimes I said, you know, as the head of the home, accept responsibility. Say, yeah, that was a wrong for me to leave the sock on the floor. I'm really sorry. And go out and buy her a bunch of flowers and then take her out to a candlelight dinner. You see? So anyway, he laughed about all this, but he did go home and do it. And 2 weeks later, we got a call from his wife. She said, I can't believe what you people have done to my husband. And she told our receptionist that he used to throw tantrums like you wouldn't believe. You see, there's always two sides to a story, isn't there? And anyway, she said that they'd had a very unhappy time, but when he came back, he started taking her out to dinner and buying her flowers and bought her a nice nightie and things like this. And so my wife and I went down to Sydney for a wedding, and we went and stayed in their home, and it was a happy home. You see, it took one person to make the decision. And another case like that was a man who came and told me that during his 10-day program that he was 50 years of age. At the age of 40, he decided he had to change his life because he'd been a hippie. Him and his wife had been basically hippies. They smoked drugs and they did all sorts of things that were wrong. And at the age of 40, he said, look, it's my 40th birthday, I'm going to change. And he went out and got a loan and he bought some land and he started up a tree nursery, started growing trees, and he started working very hard. And then he started looking at his health and he stopped taking drugs, he stopped smoking and he started eating healthy food and so on. And he said that, like, his wife resented it. And he said, for the last 5 years, we've had no intimacy in our home. He said, she works in the nursery. He said, she makes my dinner. She always eats junk herself, but she makes good food for me. She drinks coffee all day, probably anything up to 20 cups. She smokes marijuana. And he said, she's just killing herself and I can't do anything about it. I said, well, really what you need to do is buy her the flowers and all those things. He said, I've tried all that, doesn't work. So in the end, I said, well, why don't you try and get her to come to Living Valley Springs? So when he went home the next day, he called up and he booked her in. So she turned up 4 days later and sat down in my office and she said, look, I'll have you know, I'm here under duress. I don't really want to be here. You know, my husband's basically forced me to come here. I don't want to be here. So I told her to go home. I said, there's nothing I can do for you. I said, really, if you don't have the right attitude, I can't help you. Because I said, if you're going to be coming off tobacco and coffee and marijuana, I said, you're going to go through some pretty severe withdrawals for about 3 days. And you're going to hate me. If you don't want to be here, you're going to go around the wall, you know. And she just put a fist on my desk and she said, I told him I'm going to do it, now just show me to my room. You know, so, right. So, showed her to her room and she never said, you know, we never heard boo from her for the next week. She did everything right. She had all the treatments, she had the steam saunas, she drank all the water, but she would retreat to her room all the time and she never talked to anyone. Now, by about the 7th day, she was coming out of it, you know, and she must have gone through hell, you know, coming off all that stuff. But she got through it. And on the 7th day, her and I sat down and we talked. And she told me the other side of the story. She said, well, the thing was that my husband just suddenly did this big turnaround and he said, we're changing. And I wasn't ready to change. And he forced the issue on me and he's always making out that he's Mr. Goody-Goodies, you know, like he's, you know, look at the food I eat, you know, look at the things I do. And she said, and I can't keep up with that and I resent that. Now, resentment is a killer. Do you know that? Resentment is a killer. And she was trying to make a statement to him by the things she was eating and the things she was smoking and drinking. And she was trying to say to him, you know, look at me. You know, you can't change me. Anyway, I said to her, look, either you're going to have to leave him or you're going to have to just accept him as he is and just get back to being a good, happy wife and see if that will change him. Because, you know, there's some principles. Do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. If someone hurts you, do something nice back to them. It's an incredible hard thing to do, but I tell you, it works. A soft answer turns away wrath. And I told her all this. So she decided that she would think about it for a few days. Her husband came to pick her up on the following, at the end of the program, and he had a big black eye, and a bee had stung him. And she saw him coming up the path and she went running down and she put her arms around him and she said, my darling, what have they done to you? And he looked over her shoulder at me with this, you know, look at what have you done to her? You know, like, and they went for a walk, they came back holding hands and they just had a tremendous recovery of their marriage. They went away for a honeymoon about a week later and they had a wonderful recovery to their marriage. And that was quite a few years ago, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. But just recently, actually last year, she actually got cancer and she died. And he's talked to me a few times since then, and he's told me about how close they were, and he's really thanked me for those years. And he really nursed her in those last parts of her life in a very close relationship. So you see, one person had to make the decision to change. Just one person created the change in the other person. Because when she went home, she actually was able to communicate with him the problem, and he then said, yes, look, I'm really sorry. You know, I have been like that. And so it all worked its way out. Another relationship thing is between father and son. I think the father-son relationship is extremely important today, and I think that it's really one of the reasons why our society is crumbling, is because fathers are often, too busy. Like, there's been a huge move to the city in the last 50 years, and fathers are very busy in their occupations, and it's hard today to make ends meet for the average person, and that they've got to work hard, and they just don't spend that man time, that man-boy time with their sons like they should do. And so the sons are not getting the proper father figure to imitate and to come after. Has anyone ever seen a movie? I was on an aeroplane and I saw this movie, and it sort of grabbed me because I could see what it was, the lessons it was trying to teach. But it was called Big Daddy. Has anyone seen that one? Well, it was a story about a couple of young men who'd gone to Canada, and one of them had actually got a girl pregnant, and then they went back to America. They were only on a holiday. Anyway, about 5 years later, the father was away in Europe, and his flatmate was there, and the girl had died. The mother had died, and the little boy was brought to be given to the father. But he wasn't there, so the other fellow pretended he was the father, and he took custody of the little boy. And so in his own life, this man, he had a lawyer as a father, and he'd never been able to come up to his father's expectations. Constantly trying to, but his father always expected more of him than what he could do. And so he'd failed everything in his life. And he had a job as a toll collector at a bridge. And but he thought, this is one thing he's going to do properly. He's going to raise this little boy. And he used to tell the little boy all the principles of the father-son relationship. And at one stage they were in the park. And I remember he was saying to the little boy, do you know that most problems in our society are caused because of a breakdown in the relationship between father and son? And he said, now just look at this guy here, for example. And there's a guy walking through the park, and he's got a black leather jacket on, and his hair's right up in spikes, and he's got a real nasty look on his face, and he's, walking along like this. Whoops. and anyway, the guy said, hi. And he goes, ah. Yeah, and he said, forgive him. He said, forgive who? And he said, your father. And he just put his hands in his face and he started crying. He goes, my father! Oh! And he walked off like that. And it was a good lesson there. And he said to the little boy, he said, see what I mean? It goes back to the relationship. He said, that guy is a dropout because of the relationship with his father. And anyway, the story goes on. There's an old tramp in the park, and there's a pizza delivery man, and different people playing different parts in the movie. But at the end, it ends up in a court case over the custody of the little boy. They found out that this guy's not the father, and so there's a big case going on. And everybody who was in the movie is in the courtroom. And this guy gives a speech about the relationship between father and son, and he says how important it is. And he said, my relationship with my father was terrible because I couldn't come up to his expectations. But he said, I'm bringing this little boy up the right way. And he said, there's a lot of forgiveness needs to happen out there. A lot of fathers need to forgive their sons. A lot of sons need to forgive their fathers before we're going to see an improvement in our society. And he really went on about this. And the next thing you saw, the prosecutor just turn around. He got his mobile phone and he goes, hello, Dad? And then the barrister got his mobile phone. Dad? And then you saw the old tramp in the back of the court came down and he borrowed the prosecutor's phone. And he, hello, Dad? And then the next thing, everyone in the whole courtroom's ringing their fathers. You see, and there needs to be something like that happen. But I was telling this story some years ago, and it must have been taped. And a guy in New Zealand must have listened to the tape or seen the video, whatever it was. And so a couple of years ago, I was in New Zealand in Thames running some meetings, and this guy drove all the way from right up in the top of the North Island to come down and tell me this story. He said that at the age of 47, his life had been a total failure. He said every relationship he'd had been a disaster. Every job he'd had been a total failure. He's a complete failure in every aspect of his life. He said socially, he said in his occupation, and also financially, and also in relationships. And he said, anyway, when he was 11 and when he was 14, he'd had severe beatings from his father, and he hated his father. And right through his life, he hated his father, and he resented him, and he never forgave him for what he'd done. And he said at the age of 47, someone gave him a video, and he was sitting there one night watching this video, and it was me talking about this subject. And right there and then, he just decided he was going to forgive his father. Now, he said until that day, he'd had severe hypoglycemia since he was about 16. And he said it was being treated, but it was a chronic problem. He said he decided he'd forgive his father. He wrote a big letter to his dad, poured his heart out, and forgave him. And he said the next day, he never had hypoglycemia again. And he said, that was 18 months ago. And he said, I have not had a hypoglycemic attack for 18 months. Not only that, but he said, in the last 18 months, my life has become totally successful. I've got a tremendous relationship. Financially, I've become successful. I've got a tremendous job. Socially, I've become a lot more successful. He said, I can't believe it. But he said, I had to come down and tell you because what you're saying is true. He said, all those years wasted in deep-seated bitterness and hatred, complete waste, nearly wrecked my life. But he said, Dad and I have got a tremendous relationship now. I've forgiven him. We get on wonderful. And he said, and it's changed everything for me. See, can you relate to that? And I got him to write all that down and give it to me in a letter. I actually got him to go back home and write the whole story. So I've got it in a letter, which one day I'll write a book and I'll put that story in the book. But it's really important we get this relationship with each other right. And it's so important that fathers give their sons the time. And I mean, I know growing up, like with my children growing up, with my son, I made a lot of big mistakes. And I think we tend, if we want to do things right, we tend to say to our kids, like, this is where you've got to get to. Now get up there. And we whack them and we say, this is a standard you've got to achieve. Now you better achieve it. And you whack them until they do. But what we really should be doing is saying, this is as far as you've got to get. And then when they get there, you bring them up to here. And then you bring them up and slowly bring them each step of the way. And I saw a documentary once. It was one of the footballers, a very successful man in America. And they were asking him what was the key to his success. And he said, well, when I was a little boy, my father used to throw me a ball. And he said, but he never threw it far enough away that I could miss it. So I always caught it. Like he said, when I was little, he was only that far away. So I never missed. And as I got bigger, he would get further away. But he made sure I never missed it. And he said, so I grew up believing that I couldn't miss the ball. You know, that I would be successful. That's the way my father trained me, that I believed that I was going to make it. And you know, that's how we need to be with our kids. Because our kids are the next generation coming up. And we need to develop those relationships like that with them. Now, you know, another area that I was going to talk about was like to do with the father-son relationship. There's another story. Was a guy that came to me once, and he had a bad coffee addiction, about 33 years of age, and he wasn't working. He'd been on the dole for years. And in actual fact, he told me he'd never been able to hold down a job for very long, and never been able to keep a girlfriend for very long either. And his life was fairly similar to the other fellow, but he was only about in his early 30s. Now, when I got talking to him, it turns out that he said that when he was a little boy, his parents used to always put him down. Now, one day he was using a screwdriver and his father came up and he took it off him and he said, that's not how you use a screwdriver, you idiot. And he went and did it himself. And he said one day, he said, I smashed a plate in the sink when I was washing up for Mum. And she came over, whacked me and said, don't come near my sink again. And so he said, you know, I'm hopeless. I'm good for nothing. And see, his parents had told him that he was hopeless, that he was good for nothing, and he believed it. And he grew up believing it, and here he was in his early 30s and he still believed it. Now, the remedy that we recommended to him, and he did, was to go out into the community and do things for the old people. So he went out into the community and he started painting old ladies' fences and cleaning gutters around their houses and different jobs like that. And it wasn't long it was probably a year later when I bumped into him down at Noosa, and he was walking along holding hands with a lovely girl and said that this was his fiancée. And he also told me that he now had a full-time job, which his whole life had changed. And he said that once he started doing that community work, the old people started to love him, and the old people started to invite him in for a cup of tea or something, and he started to realise that he wasn't so hopeless, you see. So quite often the words we use can have such a negative impact on people. Now, there's another story I was going to tell you, was about a lady that came to Living Valley Springs quite a few years ago from Tasmania. And this lady was going to have an operation for dialysis. Her kidneys both were failing, and she had diabetes, and she had very high blood pressure. And she came to Living Valley Springs to basically prepare for surgery. And once she got that dialysis operation, she was going to be on a wait list for about 3 years to get kidneys. Anyway, we had her there for about 3 weeks. And during the first few days, we found this lady would tell such terrible stories that the other guests would just have their mouths open in amazement. Stories about child abuse, about violence, and about a lot of other things that had happened in her childhood. Eventually, the other guests couldn't handle it much more, and when this lady walked into the room, they'd sort of go out the back door. You know, that's a good way to work out what sort of person you are. If you walk into a room and everybody's face glows and they're really happy to see you, and they come closer to you, well, then you're probably doing the right thing. Right? You got it right. But if you walk into a room and people sort of gradually move out the back door, then you need to look at your attitude, your facial expressions, your body language, and so on, to see what sort of an influence you're exerting around you. But this lady was so negative that the people couldn't handle it anymore. So I got talking to her one night, and I said to her, you know, I think a lot of your problem goes back to your childhood, and that's why you got this physical problem. She had a problem with fear. And you'll find there is a connection between certain emotions and certain diseases. And there's been a definite connection between kidney disease and fear. She didn't want the light turned off in her room in the night, right? Or she wanted someone else to sleep in the room with her. And she was about 30 years old. So the fear was a major component. So we got talking, and I said, you know, what you need to do if you want to get well, it doesn't matter what we do with herbs and cleansing and therapy, until you actually forgive all those people and deal with that, you're never really going to get well. And I said, you know, forgiveness, it's a hard thing to do. But if you don't forgive, you're the one who's going to suffer. Unforgiveness doesn't hurt the other person so much as it hurts you. See, so we talked a lot about it, and she said, it's impossible for me to forgive these people. And I said, I know that. In your own strength, you can't. But I said, with God, all things are possible. And I said, if you ask God for the strength and the power to forgive, He will give it to you. And I said, but you've got to ask for it and be prepared to take it when it comes and act with it. And she said, well, I'm prepared to do that if God can do that for me. But she said, I haven't been near a church since I was about 12, and I don't even remember how to pray. So I said, well, you just talk. So we knelt down together, and she said a prayer. And she said, dear God, you know the trouble I've been through, and I rebelled from you when I was 12. And she said, and it's been a hard life. But she said, I'd really like to get it together now. And she said, you know, I've got a lot of enemies out there and a lot of people that I haven't been able to forgive. But if you can change me, I'm prepared to do whatever you do to me. If you change my heart, I'll do the forgiving. And it was something like that. And anyway, the next day she wrote a few letters, she made a few phone calls. She went out and dug a hole in the garden and symbolically buried her bitterness at Living Valley Springs. We planted some nice flowers over it. Sweetened it up. Anyway, do you know, she just started improving dramatically. Her blood pressure started coming down. Her blood sugar levels started coming down. Eventually she went home and she kept in contact with me, and within a few months she was able to cancel the operation. There was no thought of an operation anymore. And that lady recovered. Now, the interesting thing was that she went back to her church where she'd been as a little girl. And apparently they'd been praying for her for about 20 years. And she went back there and she got up the front and gave a testimony that she said, I'm coming back to church, and she said, I just want to let you all know that I'm really sorry for the way I've been in the last 20 years. And she made this big public apology because someone wrote me a letter from that church. I didn't know them, but they wrote a letter to us and said, thanks for helping our friend. And they told me the whole story. So forgiveness is so vitally important. One of the things I did tell her is that in the Bible it just says, in the book of Philippians, that leaving behind the things that are before and pressing on toward the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus, we often need to leave the stuff behind us. You know, you can't carry the bad things of the past into the future, or it's going to make you sick. And you know, there was two men that I knew quite well in Kin. One was an old man about 80, the other one was a younger man about 40. And these guys were quite good friends until one day they had a big argument. And it was quite a big argument. And the young fella sort of lost it, and he told the older man that he was a fool, an idiot, and a few other things. So the old guy was very insulted. He was insulted because he felt that because of his age, he deserved a lot more respect than that. Even in an argument, you know, those silly words shouldn't have come out. So he just cut himself off. And for the next 12 months, he wouldn't go near the other guy. There was just no contact. And I used to talk to them both, and I'd say, you know, you guys should, you know, sort it out. But they didn't want to. And I said to the old guy one day, I said, you know, you being the older, the wiser person, you can fix this whole thing up, you know. He said, I will forgive him when he comes around and tells me he's sorry. And I've been waiting for a year for that. When he comes, I'll tell him. I said, but it doesn't happen like that. And I just reminded him about when Jesus was on the cross. And I said, Jesus was on the cross. They're still, you know, like spitting on him and whipping him and everything else. And he's saying, Father, forgive them, for they just don't know what they're doing. You see, the forgiveness came first. Jesus had forgiveness in his heart. And it was that attitude that caused some of those soldiers to change their attitude. You see? Now, I said to him, what you need to do is get the young man on the phone and tell him to come around for a meal. Get him to come around. And don't mention what happened a year ago. Just act out forgiveness. Just act it out. Treat him like your long-lost friend. You know, show him your garden. Get your wife to make a nice meal for him. You know, like, don't bring the past up. So anyway, he did it. Well, the young fella told me the old guy had called him up and invited him for a meal. And he said, I wonder what he's up to. So anyway, he went around there, and the old guy shook his hand and showed him through the garden, sat down with him at the meal table. Halfway through the meal, the young guy said, you know, I really should apologise to you for what I said, the way I spoke to you last year. You remember that fight we had? The old guy said, not a problem, forgiven, forgotten. You know. But you see what brought the change? It was the person who'd been wounded was the one who had to exercise the forgiveness. And by exercising the forgiveness, it brought the change in the other person. See, sometimes we can have a fight with somebody, and we can wait for years for them to come and say they're sorry, and they never will. You know, and then we get bitter, and they get bitter, and nobody wins. Right? So we just need to get on top of all those sort of things. If we can get on top of these negative emotions and start really cleaning up the way we think toward other people, and if anybody here tonight has got any bitterness toward anyone else out there, any unforgiveness, anyone has hurt you, anyone has damaged you, or in the past has cut you off, or whatever, you know, tonight's the night when you really want to think about it and go away from here with the decision you're going to try and make things right. Now, you may not be able to, you know, they might not want to make things right with you, but you can do that with them. Just by acting out your forgiveness, your acceptance of them, your love of them. You know, love your enemies. That's a tremendous thing if you can do that. And you'll find that will have a big impact on your own life and your own health. Now, there was a guy came to Living Valley Springs about 2 years ago with high blood pressure. and he was also taking antidepressants. He was 52 years of age. His marriage had broken up about 15 years ago. He'd had a number of relationships since, and every one of them had failed. And he was now quite a lonely 52-year-old man taking antidepressants, drinking a huge amount of alcohol, and he had a blood pressure problem. So he came to us, and the physical side of dealing with him was quite easy, but we got him to spend 5 sessions with our counsellor, Joanne. Now, Joanne somehow got out of him that there was a big problem with his mother. And now his mother had been dead for quite a few years. But it went back to his childhood, and he said that he'd had a big problem with his mother, and I never really found out what it was, but that was where the root of the problem was. I didn't find this out from Joanne because those sessions are confidential. It was the guy himself came and told me. He said, Joanne got it out of me. I had this big problem with my mum, and he said, I've never dealt with it. And he said, then Mum died, and so I've just felt really bad ever since about it all. Anyway, what Joanne told him to do was write a letter. She said, you can't send it to your mum, but she's gone. But write it as if she was still here. Get it all off your chest. Just write the whole thing down and file it. You know, he was quite excited about this bit of therapy. So he went home and he did that. And it was only a matter of a few months when he told me that he was off his pills. And he's had a tremendously successful life since then. He's very recently got married to a much younger girl. And he's very, very happy, and I talk to him quite regularly. It's changed his whole life. But he said that the turnaround came when he dealt with that issue. Now, how many issues have you got? How many issues have I got? Like, what I'm saying is, if we really want to have good health, we've talked a lot about the physical aspects of health in the last few nights. You know, get the teeth done, look at your spine, you look at your diet and your lifestyle. That's all vitally important. But what about the issues up here? You know, how many chemicals are you making every day that you really shouldn't be making? Are you poisoning yourself with chemicals that are made because of bitter thinking? Get rid of the bitterness. Go and deal with it. Go and write some letters. Go get on the telephone. Act out forgiveness. Ask God to help you. Ask God to put forgiveness and love in your heart like you've never had before. And if you don't have a relationship with God, you don't have to go to any church to have a relationship with God. It's just a matter of connecting with the Creator. And that's something that really changed my whole life. When I found the Creator, that there is someone there, and He made me, and He loves me, and He deals with the emotions. You see, and that changed my life. And I can recommend that to you. Just connect with the Creator. Get to know Him. Talk to Him. Tell Him what you're doing every day. And ask Him to help you through the obstacles in your life. And if you do that, and Graham was talking about the brain chemistry, there's been studies now that show that they've wired people up. When people pray, there is a huge amount of electricity going on in the brain. You know, it's good electricity. And so when you're actually connecting with God, you're producing good chemicals that have a really good effect on the body. And that's what we call spiritual health. And so that's something that I really strongly recommend to you. There's many more stories I could tell you, but I suppose it's nearly 9:15, so we probably should call it a night. Tomorrow night we'll be talking to you about food, and John Tobin is going to do a lecture first tomorrow night about the liver, because the liver is an amazing organ. It's got 500 different functions, and it filters the blood, and it produces different chemicals in the body, and it's very, very important. And when we're understanding food and how food gets used in the body, and what bad food does to the body and so on, well then it's important that you have a good understanding of the liver. So I've asked John to present a study on the liver to start with. Do you know, if you cut someone open in an autopsy, open them right up, what's the first thing you see? It's the liver. It's this huge, big, prominent red organ. It's massive. It's the only organ in the body that if you cut 90% of it away, it will grow back. Up to 90% of the liver will grow back in a very short time. Very, very quickly. So it's quite important. So tomorrow we're going to talk about that. Then I will be talking to you about food and about what we recommend is the best diet to eat. What we've found over the years, we've changed, we've studied, and we've got into blood chemistries now, so we're actually monitoring blood chemistries as we change people's diets, and we're finding what really works. So we want to present a lot of that to you tomorrow night. But back to the subject of tonight, I hope I've made an impact on you. If you've got any emotional areas there, deal with them. And if you need help to deal with them, we're there at Living Valley Springs. Some of you might want to come out there and stay at some stage. We run a 10-day program. We find that anything shorter is not really that much worthwhile. And you just come out there and we go right through your history and your chemistry and so on. And we design a program for you, although there is a generic program, but then we tailor-make various aspects of it for the individuals. And you get a lot of therapy. You get remedial massages and lymphatic drainage, various forms of hydrotherapy and so on. And there's the counselling there, there's steam baths every day, there's cooking classes, and there's a lot of health lectures and education. And then there's individual lifestyle planning at the end of the program. So you might want to come, but you might also know other people. We're there to help people. We're a non-profit organisation. Anything that, any profit we ever do make, which we don't really, we've got a couple of other little sidelines that make a small profit that subsidise the retreat itself. But anything we make goes back into developing the facility there for people. So if you know other people who are sick and got health problems, that's where I'd recommend you send them. So that's all for tonight. We'll see you tomorrow night. And if you know people that need to know about their food, bring them along.